Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. It's a pleasure for me to give you some reflections on this study which I've just completed. It will be published by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., early next year. I actually wrote this together with a co-author whose name is Lawrence Edwards. They call us the Lawrences. Basically, he's an economist at the University of Cape Town, but he did spend a year here at CID. So this work that you're going to hear about is a product of, partly sponsored by the Center for International Development. The work is an examination of, I think, an extremely important question, which is growth in emerging economies actually good for the United States? You might find it strange that we don't simply accept the premise that a rising tide lifts all boats, and therefore automatically development in the rest of the world would be good for the United States. But in fact, if you listen to the discussions in the US, you will hear a lot of skepticism about the notion that we are all rising together. Indeed, if you listen to the debate the other night, particularly when it came to China, what I heard was two candidates falling over each other, in a sense, to try to explain how tough they were going to be to China and how unfair China has basically been to the United States. That perception is actually quite widely shared. And quite frankly, it's a very new perception, which has very important implications if it's accepted as valid. After all, for most of the post-war period, US foreign policy in general, aid, economic policy in particular, has been premised on the idea that we're all in the same boat and that we prosper when the rest of the world prospers. If we call that into question, well, maybe we still have an interest in foreign prosperity because it's good for peace, but it'll be a lot harder to explain to Americans if they don't find that they have an economic interest in that growth. So, firstly, what we did was to listen to the views of Americans. And what we found was that primarily the public's concerns, both about emerging markets in general, about China in particular, were especially focused on the question of jobs. If you ask people about international trade, what is closest to their views is how it affects employment. However, it also turns out that a number of economists, very prominent ones, have been also raising questions about whether or not growth in emerging economies is good for the United States. One very famous economist, actually Larry Summers' uncle, Paul Samuelson, wrote an article a few years ago in which he pointed out that economic theory tells us that foreign growth is not necessarily good for the home country. His answer, what economic theory tells us, is it actually all depends, as you would expect with economists. Well, what does it depend on? Well, if foreigners grow in a way that they supply you with the goods you import at low prices, well, that's terrific. But if foreigners grow in a way that makes them tough competitors for your exports, that's not so good. So in principle, we don't know whether growth abroad is good or bad for us before we investigate the facts. So that's the first economist's concern that we investigate. Is it good for American welfare? Are the patterns of growth that we see today in the emerging economies actually working out so that they raise American living standards in the aggregate, or that they threaten them? And then there's a third question. The third question relates to a concern that was actually put forward by another Nobel laureate, Paul Krugman. And this concern is, even if the growth is good for American welfare in the aggregate, it's not very good for American workers. it is in fact likely to cause a lot of wage inequality in the United States. Wage inequality, especially along the lines of skills. It might be good for the skilled workers, but it won't be good for the relatively less skilled workers who turn out to be 70% of the American labor force. So we're actually talking about something that could potentially lower American wages. So these are the three topics that I'm going to briefly touch on. The first is the question of jobs. The second, the question of aggregate welfare. And the third, the question of wage inequality. Now, it turns out when I started to think with Lawrence about this concern about employment and jobs, it's actually quite complicated. What exactly do people mean when they say they worried about trade's effects on employment? There are at least three different ideas that are all, at least three, I would say, that are all conflated in their minds. The first I would call total jobs. How is trade with emerging economies or imports affecting the ability of the economy to get to full employment? You may remember, for instance, that when we had a slow, jobless recovery in the United States in 2004, people suddenly observed that we were starting to have a lot of service employment outsourced to India. And so it became commonplace to argue that the recovery was being seriously threatened by the offshoring of these jobs to India. Offshoring is another theme that comes up in the debates continuously. So that's one dimension of that, is a concern for total employment. A second concern is a little different conceptually. It has to do with displacement, people who are actually rendered unemployed. You know, you could have the economy, in fact, in 2007, the US was virtually at full employment, and the labor force didn't grow much. But in that year, a very large number of Americans lost their jobs and got other jobs. Well, that's a very painful experience. So losing your job could be something that will occur even if total jobs remain the same. And then there's a third idea which people have, which again you heard President Obama referring to, which is what I'd call good jobs. And in the minds of many, good jobs are associated with manufacturing. And this is something that Larry Summers spoke about, but I'll touch very briefly on that. So there are these three ideas: total jobs, displacement, and good jobs. So let's think about the first, which is our findings on total jobs, employment. Now, you might believe if imports, particularly coming from developing countries, are a major impediment to employment creation in the United States, that what you would see is that during periods in which imports grow, jobs fall down. You would expect a negative correlation. What I show you here on the right is a chart which is actually the correlation between job growth, which is, I think, the blue line, and import growth. I defy you to find two series that have a closer positive correlation. So what this actually shows is that during periods in which the US is creating employment, the US is also importing. You see, when you think more deeply about imports, you realize they can be caused by fundamentally two forces. The one, which everyone's worried about, is offshoring. When jobs are closed or factories are closed in the United States and people are rendered unemployed and the jobs move abroad. The second, though, is what happens if Americans spend more money. When Americans increase their spending, they create jobs at home and they import a lot more. So in fact, now what you see here is the dominant reason for American import growth is the spending of Americans. And indeed, I believe that the best thing for the US would be more import growth, because it would mean that American spending is rising and therefore that more employment is being created. So I'm not disputing, nor do we do in our study dispute the displacement that can occur with offshoring. But what I would submit, just showing you this correlation, and I invite you to get into more depth in the book, is that the dominant source of growth is in fact demand in the United States. And it's not just the demand for final imported products, but it's also when Americans are producing more, when our factories are producing more, we buy more inputs, which we use in the factories. And so that's another big source of import growth. You'll also notice, if you look at the public opinion polls, that there is a widespread view that somehow the trade agreements we negotiated in the United States have had a very negative effect on employment growth. And in states currently like Ohio, the election campaign will point to the free trade agreement between the United States and Mexico. Well, what's interesting is that you can see here the US implemented in the mid-90s the NAFTA. And in the subsequent 6 years, what we had were 23 million jobs that were created in the United States. I'm talking about total employment. And what we saw was manufacturing employment actually increased over the period. Now, again, I would not dispute that the NAFTA may have had negative effects, certainly did, on certain people and certain employment opportunities, but it was definitely not incompatible with very sustained employment growth. So that would be my first deliverable, if you will, on the question of total employment. It's not as easy as people think. You have to get behind the employment numbers to understand whether we are being propelled by strong domestic spending or offshoring, if you will. And the dominant driver has been strong domestic spending. The second question I'll just touch on, because I don't have a slide, but I'll just talk about it, relates to displacement of workers. If you follow the news, you'll know that every week they announce the number of Americans that have been added to the unemployment rolls. Now, in order to qualify for unemployment insurance in the US, you have to be involuntarily unemployed. Either you're laid off or your factory closed. That's how you lost your job. So how many people are typically added to the rolls? Well, during bad times, maybe 430,000, 450,000 per week. During good times, 380,000. So let's call it 400,000 a week. How many weeks in the year? 52. So we're saying, and indeed this is what the data show us, that 22 million Americans experience involuntary unemployment every single year. So we asked the question, well, what percentage of those people are losing their jobs due to import competition? And so we went through a hypothetical calculation over a decade in which we figured out how many people would be displaced if, contrary to what I've just shown you, every single import resulted in the loss of that job in the United States. And when we looked at the growth over the decade of, since 2000, what we found was 3.8 million jobs. So we're talking about displacement for 3.8 million, whereas the involuntary unemployment is 20 million per year, 200 million over the decade. So we're talking about less than 2% of the people losing their jobs due to imports as an upper bound estimate. Well, I was very surprised at this. And I looked at surveys where people actually asked why they're laying off people. And I discovered that you get the same answer, around 2%. Now, don't get me wrong. For those 2% of the people, this is a very painful experience. On average, they lose between 15 and 18% of their wages when they get their next job. And it is a costly experience. I don't think we should simply leave them on their own. But what I draw from these data is that the kind of programs we need to help displaced workers regardless of the reason for their displacement. That when we try to single out trade as a source of change, we're looking at a relatively small number of people compared to the huge number who actually experience this kind of dislocation. People lose their jobs for all kinds of reasons. Firms are continuously making decisions based on technological change, on demand growth, on strategic decisions, and so on. So that's what I would say about displacement. The third issue I wanted to touch on, and it really resonated with me when Larry Summers started to talk about this question, relates to the issue of good jobs, manufactured jobs. So what I show you here is precisely what Larry had spoken about. These data, you're far away, and so am I, but these data go back to 1929. And this is the share of total employment of Americans who make goods. And what you'll see is that after about 1950, there is an amazingly strong downward trend in the share of people in the United States employed making goods. The brown line is manufacturing. The next line there are the people in agriculture, and the bottom line is people who are in mining. So what we've discovered is over time, we're reduced to less than 10% of the people in the United States who are involved in the production of goods. Goods, among their other characteristics, are very tradable. We ship them all over the world. So we were interested to ask the question, is the American labor market more or less globalized today than it was 30 years ago? There are two fundamental drivers at work here. On the one hand, there is this declining employment in goods production. On the other hand, there is the fact that services have become more tradable. And the offshoring to India is simply the best example of that. Well, we took the estimates of a variety of economists who've actually estimated what share of American jobs are potentially subject to international competition and could potentially be offshored. Alan Blinder at Princeton did a great study on this, and his conclusion was 25%. So we've got both goods plus services amount to 25% of the US labor market. Is that a frightening new world? Well, in fact, if we go back to 1970, more Americans were working in tradable goods industries than would be working in both the sum of goods plus services. So our conclusion here, which really I think is quite surprising, is that when it comes to the US labor market, we are far less global and far less globally exposed than we were 10 or 20 years ago. And it is very interesting if you look at the politics of trade, that there's a complementary study done by Craig van Grastek, who's been looking at how exercised are our politicians, how often do we see trade issues come up before the Congress. There's been a noticeable decline over time. And I think that part of it is the structural change that's taking place in the US. So what's causing this decline? Here's the share of manufacturing employment in the United States, and you can see it's like an escalator going down. We fitted a trend line through 1980, and then we forecast out of sample from 1980 until 2010, 30 years out of sample. The only thing we knew only thing this regression knows for 2010 is what's the total level of employment. And we were 25,000 jobs off. So what that suggests is there's some fundamental driver at work here. If you ask people why are we losing jobs today, they'll tell you China. They'll give you those stories. But if you take this historical view, you say, there's something very basic here that's driving this development. So let's look at other countries. They'll also tell you, well, what about Germany? Don't they do better? The bottom two shares of manufacturing employment, I'm showing you the numbers from 1973 until 2010. Those two lines are the Netherlands and the United States. And the lines are virtually identical. Germany has a higher share of its employment in manufacturing. The Germans are the top line. The slope is actually slightly larger than that in the United States. So this decline in manufacturing is not just an American phenomenon. It is universal in the industrial economies, and it is also to be found in countries like Germany, which have very large trade surpluses, whereas the US has a large trade deficit. In fact, again, I don't know if you can see this, but the changes in 12 different industrial countries in the share of manufacturing since 73 range between 11% and 15%. They're all remarkably similar. So what's going on? Well, it's what Larry explained briefly, but I'll just elaborate. In effect, productivity growth has been much faster in the production of goods than the production of services. Now, you ask the question, if we are more productive, will it mean that we have fewer jobs or more jobs in a sector? Again, economics, which is always ambiguous, says it depends. Because faster productivity leads to lower prices. And the real issue is then, how do people respond to the lower prices? If respond is technically what we call elastic, if they're very responsive, you'll create more jobs. If the response is inelastic, you'll create fewer jobs. The food story is one of inelastic demand. Well, it turns out the same is true of goods. So, since 1960, we've seen almost 100% decline. This is logarithms, so basically 2% a year. The green line is what's happened to the prices of goods compared to the prices of services. And how have Americans responded? Well, the red line is the relative quantities of goods relative to services. In only one period did they actually increase their spending, and that was between 1995 and 2000, when we went out and bought a lot of computers and telecom, and it resulted in the dot-com burst. But actually, since 2000, even when it comes to computers, the share of spending Americans, even though the price of computers have been falling 20% a year, the share of money that Americans are allocating to their computers has fallen in half over the last decade. So, in our view, the dominant driver for the decline in manufacturing employment is this combination of rapid productivity growth on the one side and demand which is not responsive to the declining prices or not sufficiently responsive. Now, from one point of view, this is a great thing, just as, and by the way, you'll also notice in the food story that the US has a very significant trade surplus in food, but it hasn't stopped the share of employment declining in the production of food. What we did was to calculate, we wanted to look at our trade balance and our trade deficit. And so we used an input-output matrix, and we calculated how many jobs are embodied in the trade deficit that the United States has. Suppose we were actually just to take that employment and create it in the US. How many jobs? Well, it turns out if you go back to 1999, you'd get about 3 million jobs. And when you go to 2010, you still get 3 million jobs. So over the period, the lines which show you, the top line is what would have happened to employment if we'd created, instead of having a trade deficit, we took all the jobs embodied in the trade deficit and created them in the US, compared with a line which we actually experienced, and we'll see the declines were virtually identical. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is this rapid productivity growth. So you have to run to stand still. And our conclusion then is that while we would add more jobs, a one-time deal if we did close our trade deficit. If we had a weaker dollar, if we had more, we would create more employment, but it's like taking a few steps up on this escalator. As long as productivity growth continues in the same way it does, as long as the demand is not responsive to the prices, the best thing to do is to train yourself for a job outside of the manufacturing sector. So that I think reconfirms what Larry has told us earlier. Okay, so that's jobs. Let me turn briefly to the two other topics. I won't go into them in anywhere near as much depth. So the question is, what's been happening to American welfare? Well, one way to look at that is to ask what's been happening to the price of our exports compared to the price of our imports. The scary story that Samuelson gave us was one, for the Americans at any rate, it would be great for the rest of the world, but the scary story was when the foreigners get good at making the things we export, that forces us to lower their prices and therefore allows us to buy fewer imports. That makes us worse off. Well, in fact, this is what's happened to the terms of trade. American export prices of manufactured goods compared to import prices of manufactured goods over the last decade or more. This is the United States, is the blue line, and the green line is Germany, and the red line is Japan. Well, the Japanese seem to have gotten into some trouble recently. But by and large, what you get is improvements in the terms of trade. Actually, where do these improvements in our terms of trade come from? Well, this is America's terms of trade with respect to our imports from other developed countries. You'll see there's almost no change over the period. But this is what's happened to America's terms of trade with respect to emerging economies. So in effect, what we've seen is that as these countries have grown, one way they've grown is through exports. They've lowered the prices of those products, and therefore it has raised American welfare. That's the conclusion of our study. We've actually used more, I'm just showing you some data here, we've used more sophisticated techniques in order to estimate how have we benefited from the combination of lower prices, of increased product quality, and of improvements in productivity that this import competition would have generated. Our conclusion is that manufactured goods from emerging economies as a whole have raised American living standards by about $500 per person, and about 250 of those are due to our imports from China. So our answer is that contrary to what Samuelson argued, which was certainly possible in theory, the way the trade patterns have evolved so far, this rising tide has been good for American welfare. We've also investigated this question of whether America is competing intensely with countries like China and others, particularly in export markets. And what's interesting here is that the top line here, we subdivided the goods. We've got resource-intensive goods, think copper, steel. And there what we find with resource-intensive goods is that the Chinese goods and the American goods have a very similar price, around 1. On the other hand, if we look at what we call low-tech goods, think clothing, the Chinese goods are cheaper, but they're cheaper by the order of about 20-30%. The bottom line is medium technology and high technology goods. And there what you'll see is, and these are in very detailed product categories, the typical Chinese goods are 1/5 of the American goods. That means they're not the same goods. They may be in the same category, but they're not the same goods. So we're actually not competing head-to-head with China in our export markets. We are competing with China to some degree in our domestic market, but not in the export markets. Now, for me, what that implies, actually, is that there's been, from an American standpoint, far too much emphasis on the Chinese exchange rate, because for the United States, the exchange rates that really matter for us, particularly as we adjust our trade balance, are the exchange rates of our competitors. The euro, the Canadian dollar, the Japanese yen. Those are the exchange rates that are very key for the United States. The final issue is wage inequality. And what I show you here is what's called the college premium. Going back to 1975, I take the average earnings of people who have a college degree as compared to those who have simply graduated from high school. And what you will see is that up until 2000, there was a dramatic increase in wage inequality in the United States along the lines of skills. It really paid to go to college. And in fact, that wage inequality has been the subject of a lot of debate. The economists were divided. How much is trade? How much is due to technological change? I'd say, the general consensus was maybe 15 or 20% due to trade, probably 80% due to technological change, which favors skilled workers, so-called skill-biased technical change. But since 2000, what's so striking is that there actually hasn't been a very big increase in wage inequality in the United States. In fact, the college premium, the college students have done slightly worse than those who have a high school in terms of improving their wages. They still earn higher wages, but the improvements haven't been there. In fact, the US story since 2000 is one of virtually no one's wages rising. It hasn't been increases in wage inequality, it's been weak real wage growth, and it's been virtually across the board. The very richest Americans have continued to do well, and certain people with advanced degrees have done well. But if we were expecting to see a huge shock from China, where we would expect to see it is in the relationship of those without much education to those, say, with a college education, and you don't see that. Now, again, I don't want to leave with the impression that there aren't significant wage effects that occur to particular occupations, to people who live in particular locations, what we call specific wages. Those have been adversely affected by international competition. But you can see, given the small share of Americans who are directly involved in that type of competition, that you're not going to explain a lot of the variation in wages in the United States on the basis of that kind of shock, on a specific shock. So the bottom line then is, where we come down, and I can't read my own conclusions, but I do have a vague sense of what they were, is the following. Number one, a lot of America's problems are made in the United States. In a sense, that's a very good answer to the issue, because it means we can remain masters of our fate. And it seems to me that rather than buy into these allegories which explain our problems as the result of the, irregular, to be polite, behavior of others, we need to look at what's happening to our own economy. When it comes to total jobs, I think, as Larry pointed out earlier, it has to do with how well we stimulate demand and spending in the United States, and indeed production in the United States. That's going to ultimately be the driver, and I will applaud when I see our trade balance actually gets more negative, because I believe it will be associated with increased employment creation. One of the great strengths of our economy is that we have a very volatile labor force, that people are changing, and they are doing so typically relatively easily, but not recently. That goes back to the whole question of the high unemployment rates. But there, I think, where we need to improve our policy relates to our adjustment assistance programs for all workers. I mean, for instance, we still have it quite possible, although it's going to change in a few years, that Americans who rendered unemployed could lose their health insurance. Or they're given the opportunity to buy health insurance at the time they can least afford it, which is when they lose their jobs. So we need to upgrade, it seemed to me, our unemployment insurance program to reflect the realities of what people need in the 21st century. The third issue relates to manufacturing. There, I think, We could reverse some of the employment losses, but they're not likely to be long run. And this has been an astoundingly painful experience. We in the United States have experienced employment falls in manufacturing on the order of about a third of the total employment in the sector since 2000. So it's come in two large declines. And it comes from the failure to sustain economic growth in the face of this rapid productivity growth. So that's ultimately the core to some stability. When it comes to our competition head-to-head with emerging economies, if you look carefully, what you notice is that their per capita incomes, the per capita incomes of China are 20% of those of the United States, maybe 22. Per capita income of India is 10%. And for likely, in my view, for the next 10, 20 years, we are unlikely to be engaged in head-to-head competition. A lot of the work that Ricardo does here, chronicles how countries specialize as they develop. And basically, if you look back in history, when in 1950, the Japanese were 20% of the levels of the United States. Basically, what the Japanese were doing is producing goods that competed with American domestic products in imports. The Japanese sold us clothing, apparel, later steel, automobiles. Only in the 1970s did we see that they started to take us on head-to-head in our export markets. A similar thing is true of Europe. So my view is that we could well face head-to-head competition with China and other emerging economies, but it still is some time in the future. And so the bottom line here is that growth in emerging economies is actually not the entire solution to America's problem, but part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Thank you.